Was a demon, the laws ain't know how to deal with him. Catch a op in traffic, he clapping, I bet I still hit him. I done lost a lot of niggas.
You took his life and said bye. You showed no remorse for him. None. Not for me, not for my daughter, not for his kids. I can't believe that I felt sorry for you for a moment. But I didn't know all the facts. I didn't know everything. I have no remorse for you. I have no empathy because you had no remorse for my son and you showed no empathy for him. You deserve every single year they can give to you.
This is Quanisha Nicole Johnson, a 30-year-old mother of 3 who would transform an ordinary Sunday morning into an absolute nightmare that would leave her children's father bleeding out on her front lawn while police officers stood just feet away, completely powerless to stop what was about to unfold. On November 27, 2022, the police were called to what seemed like just another domestic dispute in Lithonia, Georgia. But before the sun would set that day, 29-year-old DeMonte Smith would take his final breath, and the woman who pulled the trigger would claim she was the real victim all along.
When I shoot him, after I done called the cops and did everything I was supposed to do.
Just make sure you can articulate
what's
going on.
But before we get to that devastating moment that was captured on a 911 call where you'll hear Johnson coldly repeating one chilling word over and over again as Smith's life slipped away, let me take you back to where this toxic relationship began, where warning signs were everywhere, and where we'll uncover exactly how a night-out clubbing spiraled into cold-blooded murder. Or was it really self-defense, like she claims? The story begins in the early morning hours of November 27, 2022, when Quanisha Johnson called 911 requesting a police escort to her own home. She had been out the previous night celebrating a friend's birthday, her first night out since giving birth to her youngest child just 2 months earlier. She had left her 3 children in the care of DeMonte Smith, the father of her youngest baby, expecting to return by 6 o'clock in the morning. But as the night wore on and the club lights flashed and the music pounded, Johnson's phone went dark. Smith tried desperately to reach her throughout the night, and when hours passed with no response, he and his family began searching hospitals and jails, fearing the worst happened to the mother of his child. When Johnson finally turned her phone back on around 9 o'clock that morning, a conference call ensued that would set the stage for the tragedy about to unfold. Smith was furious, and during that heated call, he angrily threatened to hit her when she got home. It was these threats that prompted Johnson to call 911, telling dispatchers she was afraid of her boyfriend and needed officers to escort her safely back to her residence. She explained that this fear wasn't unfounded. Just 2 weeks earlier, during another argument, Smith had allegedly grabbed her and forcefully slammed her to the ground, though she had never reported that assault to police. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, Johnson arrived at her home on Edenberry Lane with DeKalb County police officers. But what happened next would become one of the most controversial aspects of this entire case.
I got a gun right here. I'm licensed.
Okay.
Johnson immediately disclosed to the responding officers that she was a licensed gun owner and had her weapon with her. Following what they claimed was standard safety protocol, the officers instructed her to secure the firearm in her truck before they approached the house. She complied, locking her gun away in her vehicle. But here's where things get absolutely mind-boggling. Within minutes, as tensions escalated and the argument between Johnson and Smith intensified right there in front of the police, Johnson began asking the officers very specific, very calculated questions about Georgia's self-defense laws.
When I shoot him, after I done called the cops and did everything I was supposed to do.
Just make sure you can articulate
what's
going on.
Think about that for just a moment. A woman who has just been escorted home by police officers, who has just locked her gun away at their request, is now standing in her driveway asking these same officers what would happen if she defended herself. What would happen if she shot someone in self-defense? The officers, caught off guard by these bizarre questions, told her to make sure she could articulate her reasons, essentially advising her on how to justify a shooting that hadn't even happened yet. The body cam footage captures Johnson behaving in what officers would later describe as an increasingly combative manner, arguing loudly with Smith while their infant child was held between them, while her other children were watching from inside the house. The officers attempted to mediate the dispute, trying to calm both parties down, trying to find some sort of peaceful resolution to what seemed like just another toxic relationship argument. But what the officers didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly anticipated, was that Smith had already decided to leave. He had pulled his phone and requested a ride share to take him away from this situation. He was done. He was trying to de-escalate. He was trying to walk away before things got any worse. But Johnson had other plans entirely. The argument continued to escalate despite the police presence, despite attempts at mediation, despite every opportunity for both parties to just walk away and cool down. And then, in a moment that would change everything, Johnson decided that prosecutors would later argue was premeditated, calculated, and absolutely inexcusable. She walked back to her truck, the same truck where she had locked away her gun at the officer's request, and she retrieved not just her firearm, but also a tire iron. Johnson then walked back into her home armed with both weapons. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. She instructed one of her children to call 911 and falsely claim that Smith was abusing her. The child, following her mother's instructions, made that call while Johnson confronted Smith inside the house. She struck Smith in the head with the tire iron, and then, as the 911 call was recording every sound, every scream, every moment of terror, she pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out, captured clearly on the emergency call recording, and in the moments that followed as Smith stumbled toward the door, as blood began to pour from his wounds, as their children screamed in horror at what they had just witnessed, Johnson's voice could be heard on that 911 recording, repeating one word over and over again. Bye. 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 Smith managed to exit the house, his body already shutting down from the catastrophic injury. He saw the police officers who were still outside, the same officers who had been there trying to keep the peace just minutes earlier. He told them what had happened, that Johnson had attacked him, that she had shot him. And then right there on the front lawn, while those officers watched helplessly, DeMonte Smith collapsed. The rideshare he had requested to escape the situation, to leave peacefully and avoid exactly this kind of violence, would arrive moments too late. By the time that car pulled up to take him away from danger, Smith was already dying. The officers immediately called for emergency medical personnel, but the damage was done. DeMonte Smith, 29 years old, father of 4 children, including the 2-month-old baby he had been caring for all night while Johnson was out, was pronounced dead. His crime was that he was angry that his girlfriend had disappeared for hours after a night out. His punishment? Death, delivered by the mother of his youngest child while police officers stood just feet away. Johnson was immediately arrested at the scene, and what came next in the investigation would reveal a story that was far more complex and far more damning than anyone initially realized. The detectives who arrived to process the crime scene would uncover evidence that directly contradicted nearly every claim Johnson would make about what happened that morning, and the interviews that followed her arrest would show a woman who seemed more concerned with justifying her actions than showing any remorse for taking the father of her child away from this world forever. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, while Smith's body was being examined by medical personnel and his family was being notified of his death, Johnson was taken to the police station for questioning. The interrogation room footage would later become crucial evidence in understanding exactly what had transpired and what Johnson's mindset had been in those critical moments before she pulled the trigger. And what she told detectives in that room would ultimately seal her fate. Johnson maintained from the very beginning that the shooting was an act of self-defense. She told investigators that Smith had threatened her during the morning phone call, that he had assaulted her 2 weeks prior, and that when he came at her inside the house, she had no choice but to defend herself with deadly force. She even referenced her earlier conversation with the police officers about Georgia's self-defense laws, suggesting that she had done her research and knew exactly what she was legally allowed to do to protect herself in her own home. But here's where her story started to fall apart under scrutiny. When detectives pressed her for details about what Smith had actually done inside the house that justified shooting him, Johnson admitted that Smith had not physically assaulted her that day. The physical evidence at the scene told an even more damning story. Crime scene investigators found the tire iron, the weapon Johnson had used to strike Smith in the head before shooting him, though its exact location and chain of custody would later become a contentious point during the trial. They recovered the firearm, examined the trajectory of the bullet that had torn through Smith's body, and documented the blood spatter patterns. Perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the evidence related to the children who had witnessed this horror unfold. The 911 recording captured not just Johnson's voice and the gunshot, but also the terrified screams of the children who watched their mother shoot their sibling's father. The prosecutors would later argue that exposing these children to such violence, making them witnesses to a killing, constituted cruelty to children under Georgia law.
He's dancing around, though, that elephant we talked about in the room, which is if there is a felony and there is a death, it's going to trigger this felony murder rule. So Michael's got to actually really clear the table. He can't leave stuff dangling. And that's tough when his client's actions were so clearly thought about. They were considered. She had put time into this in the days, weeks, months ahead of the killing. And that makes a big problem with the self-defense line and some of these other authenticity questions about her intent. It is very easy for a jury in this situation watching those police videos to infer and conclude that she knew right what she was doing. She was going to go on in there was going to be a fight, she was going to pull out a gun and shoot him. And you're not allowed to go in with that kind of pre-existing knowledge and intent without criminal liability attaching. And that's the hard part. She has so much of a great self-defense case, just not everything.
Right.
As detectives pieced together the timeline of events, they discovered that the entire incident, from Johnson's arrival with police to the fatal shooting, had unfolded in a matter of minutes. The officers who had escorted her home, who had instructed her to lock away her weapon, who had tried to mediate the dispute, were still standing outside when the gunshot rang out. They had been mere feet away, separated only by walls and doors, completely unable to prevent the tragedy that Johnson had seemingly orchestrated right under their noses. The case was assigned to DeKalb County's Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Unit, prosecutors who specialized in exactly these kinds of complex, emotionally charged cases where claims of abuse and self-defense often clouded the truth of what really happened. 8 months after DeMonte Smith took his last breath on that front lawn in Lithonia, Quanisha Nicole Johnson would finally face a jury of her peers in a courtroom where the truth about what happened that November morning would be laid bare for the world to see. The trial, which took place in August 2023, would captivate observers as prosecutors and defense attorneys painted wildly different pictures of the same woman and the same deadly encounter. The prosecution, led by Senior Assistant District Attorneys Faron Shaw and Jennifer Skocko, argued that Johnson was not a victim, but a calculated aggressor who had orchestrated Smith's death with chilling premeditation. They presented the jury with devastating evidence, the body cam footage showing Johnson asking about self-defense laws just minutes before the shooting, the 911 recording capturing her cold bye-bye as Smith lay dying, the testimony of officers who described her combative behavior, and most importantly, her own admission that Smith had not assaulted her that day.
Almost encouraging her to defend herself because they're not going to. Make sure you can articulate your reasons. That's what the person she called to protect her said when she said, I'm going to defend myself. What happens if I defend myself? What happens if I shoot in self-defense if he puts his hands on me again? What happens? Just Go ahead and articulate it. Make sure you can articulate it. The police officer who went through the academy, who's post-certified, who's trained in these domestic situations.
But the defense attorney, Michael Sterling, fought back with a narrative that placed the blame squarely on the very officers who had been called to protect Johnson. He argued that the police had failed her, that they had told her to articulate her reasons for self-defense and then abandoned her to face an abuser alone, that they had taken away her means of protection by having her lock up her gun, and that when she called for help, the system had let her down so completely that she had no choice but to take matters into her own hands. The jury was presented with 7 charges, including malice murder, felony murder, multiple counts of aggravated assault, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and cruelty to children. For days, they listened to testimony, watched video footage, heard the horrifying audio recordings, and examined every piece of evidence that both sides presented. And when they finally retired to the deliberation room to decide Johnson's fate, the entire community waited with bated breath to see whether they would view her as a murderer or as a victim who had been pushed too far. The verdict came down on August 25, 2023. The jury acquitted Johnson of both malice murder and felony murder, the most serious charges that could have sent her to prison for life. But they did not find her completely innocent. Instead, they convicted her of voluntary manslaughter, a lesser charge that recognized the killing as an act driven by sudden passion and provocation rather than cold, calculated premeditation. They also found her guilty of aggravated assault in a family violence context, cruelty to children for exposing her kids to the violence, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. 3 days later, Johnson stood before Judge Stacey Heydrich for sentencing. The prosecution asked for 25 years in prison plus 5 years of probation, arguing that the brutal nature of the crime and the trauma inflicted on the children warranted the maximum punishment. But Judge Heydrich ultimately sentenced Johnson to 20 years total, 5 years in prison, 5 years under house arrest, and 10 years on probation. She also granted Johnson first offender status under Georgia law, meaning that if she successfully completes her sentence, the conviction could eventually be expunged from her record. Johnson's defense team immediately filed an appeal, and the judge granted her bond pending that appeal, a decision that outraged prosecutors and Smith's family members who believed she should remain behind bars. As of today, Johnson remains on house arrest, her ultimate fate still hanging in the balance as appellate courts review whether she received a fair trial and whether the evidence truly supported her conviction. Social media erupted with reactions to the case, with thousands of people weighing in on whether justice had been served. Some viewed the voluntary manslaughter conviction as appropriate, recognizing the complexity of domestic violence situations while still holding Johnson accountable for taking a life. Others saw it as a miscarriage of justice, arguing that she should have been convicted of murder or that she should have been fully acquitted based on self-defense. What do you think about this? Let me know in the comments section. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.